Welcome to the Center for Pedestrian and Bicyclist Safety webinar series. Today's topic is Spatial and Temporal Shifts in Pedestrian Serious Injuries and Fatalities, presented by Dr. Robert Schneider and Dr. Nick Ferenchak. The Center for Pedestrian and Bicyclist Safety is a Tier 1 university transportation center funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation. Our center is based at the University of New Mexico with research partners at San Diego State University, UC Berkeley, the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. You can visit our website at pedbikesafety.org, where you can sign up for our monthly newsletter at the bottom of any page, and you can also follow us on LinkedIn. For today's webinar, we will use the Q&A function, so you can tap the Q&A button to ask a question at any time. We will get to those questions at the end of the webinar and answer as many as we can. Now for introductions, Dr. Robert Schneider is a professor and co-chair of the UW-Milwaukee Department of Urban Planning and an associate director of the Center for Pedestrian and Bicyclist Safety. He has led more than 30 peer-reviewed journal articles on topics such as traffic safety, travel behavior, and data collection. He is also co-leading the development and validation of a new national pedestrian level of traffic stress method. Dr. Schneider chaired the TRB Pedestrian Committee from 2014 to 2020 and is currently a member of the TRB Standing Committee on Integrated Transportation Safety Management. Dr. Nick Ferenchak is an associate professor in the Gerald May Department of Civil, Construction, and Environmental Engineering at the University of New Mexico, and he is the center director of the Center for Pedestrian and Bicyclist Safety. Dr. Ferenchak is focused on developing sustainable and resilient transportation systems primarily through improved health and safety outcomes. Nick teaches highway and traffic engineering on the undergraduate and graduate levels and is active in domestic and international societies, including ITE and the Transportation Research Board, being recently appointed as the chair of the TRB Standing Committee on Pedestrians. And with that, let's begin. Take it away, Bob.
Right, thanks so much. Ben, can you see my screen okay? Just double check.
Looks great.
Okay, thanks so much for having me. Thanks. It's an honor to join along with Nick to be a part of the webinar. This is a really important topic in understanding some of the pedestrian fatality and serious injury trends over the last 15 years or so. There's three things that I want to start with so that everybody has some sort of baseline understanding of the problem. The U.S. pedestrian safety crisis, if we look back at the data that NHTSA's captured through the fatality analysis reporting system since 1975, we saw 3 decades of pretty steady decreases in pedestrian fatalities. Since 2009, between there and 2023, there's a 78% increase. So to put that in real lives terms, is real people's lives, we've lost 3,000 people per year more in 2022, 2023, relative to 2009. So this has been a really steep increase. The next thing about it that you should know is that the United States is somewhat unique among the higher income countries around the world. Most countries in the decade of the 20-teens saw decreases in pedestrian fatalities. We were one of the only ones that saw increases. And then another aspect of it is if we look at data on all types of crashes, all injury severity levels, fatalities are clearly going up. And this is data from 9 states. But the moderate and minor injuries, so the total number of crashes for pedestrians actually went down some. So it's really the most severe and fatal crashes where we see this trend. So these are important background pieces of information to know as we dig into some of our research. Something else that we think about from a theoretical framework is, well, how do the crashes happen in the first place? And we really want to understand this trend. We know that there's certain safety outcomes, and much of what we'll talk about in this particular webinar focus on fatal and severe injury pedestrian crashes, or I'll use the term FSI. And we focus on those partly because fatalities, the numbers are still relatively small. When you add the severe injuries, you have more information about some of the causal factors. But looking at this diagram, why do crashes happen? It's important to understand there's an underlying risk in any transportation and land use system. So if you imagine a system without any people in it, so just roadways and destinations for activity according to the land uses and how that's been developed, you don't have any people, there's no crashes, there's no injuries. When you add people and you add people in vehicles, then you have the potential for crashes to occur. That's really the exposure part that we're talking about. And then the drivers and the pedestrians and other street users behave in certain ways. And so there's behaviors that potentially lead to collisions and ultimately injuries as well. And when we think about the more severe and fatal crashes, those outcomes are related to how impactful the collisions are. So the amount of force that occurs if a collision, when a collision takes place. So this is a broad framework just to think about what may be going on to lead to those safety outcomes. And you can get into many more details of each of these parts, from road design, vehicle characteristics, development on the underlying risk side. And then think about, well, there's different ways to measure the exposure: walk trips, vehicle trips, distances. There's many different types of behavior that we look at in transportation safety. And then socioeconomic characteristics probably have some influence and relationship with especially exposure and behavior. So these are some of the factors that we look at in our research. What we want to really understand is, how are they shifting in space and in time periods of the day and the week as years pass? And if we can understand how those shifts are occurring, then maybe we can do something to prevent those fatalities and serious injuries from occurring in the future, ultimately supporting efforts to move towards Vision Zero and other policy initiatives. So my focus here will be on a few of the studies that we've done as a part of the Center for Pedestrian and Bicyclist Safety, and then some work we did in parallel for the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. I have many colleagues who've helped with this, a great research team here at UW-Milwaukee. You'll notice Nick was a part of some of these studies as well, so we collaborate across the UTC on this. First of all, I'll focus on some of our geographic analyses. One question we've asked is, well, what neighborhood characteristics have had significant associations with shifts in these fatal and severe crashes during the 2010s? And so looking at certain potential explanatory variables in the categories listed below. We gathered data from 8 different states. And so at the state level, we don't just look at fatalities, we can get the severe injury data. So we have more data to work with down to the neighborhood level. We would love to look at an individual year by individual year basis, but there's a lot of variation in that. So we're looking at 5-year periods, one at the early end of the 2010s and one at the later end of the 2010s. For most states, this was 2008 through 12, compared with 2017 through 21. So how do the changes in crashes at the census tract level, the number of crashes that get geocoded into each of these locations, how do those change? So just to give you a sense of the scale of census tracts, I zoomed in on Milwaukee here. 2 kilometers is a distance that covers several census tracts. So you get the scale here. If we look at the city of Los Angeles, we can see an example of how our before data compare with our after data. And you see overall, the number of fatal and severe pedestrian crashes has gone up. You see more dark grays and black color tracts. And you can see certain areas of this region have more of an increase than others. So we want to understand, well, what are the characteristics of those places that saw the biggest increases? So the variables we looked at are shown here, some of them representing the underlying risk, some representing exposure in particular, and then a number that represent socioeconomic characteristics. These are the data that were available across all of our 8 states at the census tract level. Getting into the results, what we found are many significant associations with the number of fatal and severe pedestrian crashes per tract. The factors highlighted in red are ones that have a positive association. In other words, if you see more population, more jobs, more transit use, et cetera, on the exposure side, you tend to see more fatal and pedestrian crashes. You can see the other characteristics that have positive associations, and there's some negative associations. Areas with higher population density actually have lower association with FSI crashes. And then higher income tracts are associated with fewer fatal and severe injuries. This is pretty consistent with the literature we have seen and reviewed in going into these studies. A couple other things to point out here. The arterials that have more than 20,000 vehicles per day, if a census tract has one of those, it's more likely to experience more fatal and severe injury pedestrian crashes. In addition, tracts that have a higher proportion of retail jobs are more likely to see those types of crashes. So that was in the early period. You'll note if I look at the later period as well, that there's a lot of similarities in terms of the factors that are associated with those crashes. Not surprisingly, the system operates in a relatively similar way. But you'll also note there are some shifts. If you look at those numbers, those coefficients, which are odds ratios here, some have gone up and some have gone down. And I'll just add some arrows here so you can see which those are. I won't go through them in detail on this slide, but this is where the numbers are coming from to summarize here. So first of all, overall, across both time periods, neighborhoods with more of these fatal and severe pedestrian crashes have these more freeways, more high volume arterials. They have lower population densities. They're close to transit. They have more retail jobs, higher unemployment, higher Black and Hispanic populations. So this was seen in both periods. What's particularly interesting to our study is where these crashes have shifted towards. We saw more towards freeways, more in these retail-oriented corridors, more close to transit stops, areas served by transit, and then additional crashes in these communities of color that we already noted were important positive associations in the previous period. And also away from higher job density, which in general we're interpreting as meaning, we aren't seeing as many fatal and severe crashes in central business districts where the highest job density is, but they're more spreading out into corridors with lower job density, more towards outer ring or inner ring suburbs and locations that are further from the core metro area. So this summarizes where we saw some of those significant factors falling in the theoretical framework that we have. So we've got some clear connections with the underlying risk. We're seeing that evidence. We're seeing exposure having the expected effect. And then we're also seeing some socioeconomic characteristics being associated with these safety outcomes. We don't have a number of things. And I want to make sure we're clear about the limitations, and we need more research to find these things out. But we don't have specific data on walk trips, where those walk trips exactly are occurring. We just have commuting to work, which is very a small sample, a small part of all the walking that occurs. We don't know how much distance people are walking in different sorts of places. We don't have any data on the vehicle characteristics. As the decade went on, more vehicles were larger. So vehicle size and vehicle front ends grew over this time. Road design may have changed. We had data just from 2016 for our road design variables. We didn't have a before and an after, so we just were using that single time period variable. And then there's many potential behaviors that might have changed over time, but we didn't have any data on these. It's really hard to gather these, especially across multiple census tracts in multiple states. So there's a lot of work to be done still to really understand these underlying factors. And, did socioeconomic characteristics, did those have some sort of association? We found some of them to be significant. Did they operate through changes in exposure, or did they operate through changes in behavior? We don't know that, but these are things we want to investigate into the future. Another angle we took on it was doing a parallel study in Wisconsin, just to give you a sense of what we saw at different population density levels. We took the crashes that occurred at these and looked at them over time. You can see the time periods that I'm comparing there. And the largest increases were in the areas with dense suburban and sparse suburban development. There was actually a decrease in the highest density urban areas in the proportion of crashes there. These are fatal and severe injury crashes again, and also a decrease in the rural areas. So in particular, there's something about these dense and sparse suburban areas that seem to be where we've seen the greatest increases. Another way of looking at that here in the Wisconsin area is we looked at our top 20 cities and saw how some of the changes had occurred. Uh, some of these cities are relatively small, so there's a lot of variation in the data. But if we zoom in on Milwaukee, we can see over that time period that we saw an increase in the city of Milwaukee in fatal and severe pedestrian crashes, a decrease in some of the more further out suburban areas, but some of the biggest increases were actually in the inner ring suburban areas. And so you'll see more from Nick about this sort of trend when he presents some of his work. Then I want to spend the last couple of minutes talking about some temporal shifts over time. So how have the pedestrian fatal and severe injuries been shifting within hours of the day and days of the week? Um, as far as daytime, many people are aware that the biggest increases in fatalities have been at night. Anywhere between 85 and 90% of the additional fatalities that were experienced in the 2020s versus 2010 were at night. And so this graph shows that clearly. We dug a little bit deeper into the days of the week and looking across those 9 states that were our study areas. This shows the trend that you'd expect, that pedestrian crashes do concentrate in the late afternoon and early evenings on most days of the week. You can see the nighttime crashes on Saturday and Sunday in both the earlier and later periods. But what's interesting to look at from the perspective of shift is how have those numbers changed over time? What are the time periods that saw the most increase? And you can see the oranges and reds there. The changes in numbers and the percentage increase really highlight those nighttime crashes on every single day of the week from 6 p.m. to midnight, but also on Monday through Friday, on really late night to early morning hours. You can see still the sample sizes of crashes are pretty small for 3 to 6 a.m., comparing 2008 through 12 to 2017 through 21, but there's a big percentage increase during that time period. What's interesting, if you dig a little bit deeper, is that this varies by state. We looked at several of the different states individually. California, the patterns there when we look by time of day are very similar to the national trend. Of course, California's crashes make up about a third of our sample of 9 states. So it's not surprising that it does match up pretty well there, those same particular time periods. But if we look at New York State, and New York State's going to be heavily dominated by crashes in New York City, but we don't see such a strong increase in New York State for those 6 p.m. to 12 a.m. time periods. And really the percentage increases during those late night, early morning hours aren't too notable either. So there's some differences when I flip back and forth between New York and California. So this is it's an area for additional important research. One thing to note about New York State is that the pedestrian crashes between the earlier and later period across the 2010s actually went down. And so it seems to be interesting that was also associated with not a big increase in the nighttime crashes. So some big overall findings related to these temporal shifts. If we're seeing crashes increase over at night to nighttime, that is expected to give us the higher injury severity. And we're seeing those particular times all days between 6 p.m. and midnight, and then on those weekdays from 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. We don't know why there's some of the state level differences, but thinking about differences in unhoused populations, are there changes in vehicle speeds or different types of employment that are going on? These are things we'd like to explore some more. So that's a summary of some of the work that we did. Many thanks to our UWM research team. I'm going to take questions on my part at the end after Nick has a chance to cover his research, so I'll pass it off to him now. Yeah, stop sharing here.
Great, thanks, Bob.
There you go.
Thank you very much. All right. Okay. Yeah, good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. Thanks, Bob, for the awesome presentation. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Like Bob mentioned, for a Q&A, there should be a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and that ribbon. Please feel free to put any questions that you have down there, and we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So like Ben mentioned before, my name is Nick Ferenchak. I am a professor in the Civil Engineering Department at the University of New Mexico, and also the director for the Center for Pedestrian and Bicyclist Safety. And I'll be covering kind of the same general topic that Bob covered. I think a lot of our findings are going to align and point in the same direction. Hopefully this adds a few different perspectives and nuances. And in general, I'm going to be covering 4 different papers. I'll go over them fairly quickly, but definitely feel free to ask any questions, or I'd be happy to provide the full papers to anybody that's interested. So the first thing I wanted to look at was temporal trends in pedestrian safety. And then that's going to lead to a focus on nighttime. And so we wanted to actually look at kind of the spatial trends for these nighttime collisions. And that's going to kind of lead us out into the suburbs a little bit and thinking about pedestrian safety kind of citywide or across the entire region. And then we'll wrap up with some of the implications of all this work. So I think Bob did a good job of setting the stage, but I also kind of wanted to just give some big picture justification of why this is so important, recognizing that I'm probably preaching to the choir here. But here are pedestrian fatality rates per capita for the US. And you can see the good news is that we've been pulling those down for about 50 years now. The bad news is that we've kind of stagnated, even gone up a little bit in the last 10 to 15 years. And to really temper kind of that good news, we're really lagging behind our international peers. So if we could just meet the transportation safety outcomes of our international peers, we would be saving 20 to 30,000 American lives every single year. So what's holding us back in terms of our transportation safety goals? Here you can see this is the overall number of fatalities in the US over the last 25 years for people in vehicles. And there's actually fewer people killed in vehicles today than there were 25 years ago. So overall, if you're in a vehicle, you're probably safe as or safer than you have been historically. Probably no surprise, given the name of our center. It's very much pedestrian and bicyclist safety that's holding us back from realizing our overall transportation safety goals. So relative to that low point around 2009, 2010, pedestrian and bicycle fatalities have increased about 80% over the last 10 to 15 years. And we'll loop back to this at the end, but I'd really like to make the case that if we want to reach our transportation safety goals, we really need to be focusing on pedestrian and bicycle safety. Okay, so the first paper that I wanted to cover is focused on temporal trends. And so for this one, we being my former grad student, Risa Gutierrez, and Patrick Singleton, professor up at Utah State University, we wanted to take a deeper dive into the pedestrian fatalities. So I mentioned 80% increase in pedestrian fatalities over the last 12, 13 years. And like Bob identified, something like 75% of the additional fatalities are occurring at night. So we wanted to look at 2 different things. We wanted to look at, well, what's happening at night and versus what's happening during the day. And we also wanted to look at injury severity. So we have good data and lots of research on fatalities because we have data for fatalities across the entire US. But we wanted to do a deeper dive into pedestrian collisions all across the injury severity spectrum. So to do this, we looked at 3 large states, California, North Carolina, and Texas, over the 2010 decade. And what we found is that, and hopefully you can see my cursor there, what we found, the dark black horizontal line, That's the about 10% population growth in these states over that decade. And what we found is that it's not just fatalities that are increasing, it's also serious injuries. On the other hand, minor and possible injuries actually aren't increasing that much more than we would expect given the population increases that we're seeing in these places. So that's kind of telling us that it's really a shift in severity, not so much a shift in overall number of pedestrians being struck. The overall number of pedestrian crashes did increase about 20% compared to about a 10% increase in population growth. So there are more pedestrians being struck out there, but even stronger is the increase in severity when those collisions do occur. So then we broke it apart a little bit further, looking at daytime versus nighttime for these different injury severities. We kind of found two major things here. Up top, we found that severities are increasing throughout the entire day. So you can see that up top, fatalities and serious injuries at nighttime increased about 75%, but even during the day, serious injuries and fatalities increased about 30 to 40%. So we are seeing a shift in higher severity, not just at night, but all throughout the day. And then in terms of frequency, we're seeing more collisions at night. You can see even lower injury severity collisions increased 25 to 30% at night, so much more than we would expect given population growth. But during the day, overall, there's not that many more pedestrians being struck than we would expect given the increases in population. So something's going on out there in terms of pedestrian crashes that's increasing severity all throughout the day and increasing frequency of collisions specifically at night. So I think one thing, and Bob mentioned this, and we don't have a good grasp on it, we just don't have good data on it, is a lot of people throw out the idea, well, maybe there's just more pedestrians out there, maybe exposure has increased. And I think these results kind of question that. I think maybe exposure has something to do at night because we are seeing more pedestrians being struck at night. But during the day, we're not seeing that many more pedestrians given the population growth happening in the background. So I think it kind of tempers that. Maybe exposure has something to do, especially at night, but there's something else going on out there that's really pushing the severity of these crashes all throughout the day. So that led us to dive a little bit deeper into some nighttime crashes. And so with this paper, I worked with Masoud Abadi, a professor at Sacramento State, and we were looking specifically at characteristics of these nighttime pedestrian fatalities all across the US. And we were really looking at the decade before that increase began and the decade after that really strong increase in pedestrian fatalities began. And what we found here is kind of the usual suspects. So much of the increase occurred on arterial roads, as you can see in red on the top left. In terms of number of lanes, most of these collisions are happening on 2-lane roads, but much of the increase actually happened on 3 or 5-lane roads. So that might be hinting at what's causing these crashes to be more severe, larger, faster roadways, and speed limits between 30 and 45 miles an hour. So probably sounds familiar to everybody, your large, fast arterial roadways. Location was almost all non-intersection, non-crosswalk, so pedestrians kind of darting across mid-block on these large arterials. So that probably sounds familiar to everybody. One other thing that came out of this paper was this area that's reported on FARS. And so we found something like 98% of the additional pedestrian fatalities over that decade where they were really increasing occurred in urban areas. And that's probably the least exciting statistic you've ever heard. No duh, of course. We even considered just leaving this one out because what can you get from that? But that kind of triggered us to think, well, there's so much more there that we want to dig into. So even though this statistic was not super exciting, it kind of led us to do a deeper dive into, well, what does that urban actually mean? So the next paper I did with my then undergrad student, he just completed his master's, Osidius Rodriguez. And so here we're looking at 22 years of pedestrian fatalities across the US. We're really looking at spatial attributes of those. So the first thing that we did is we took all of those pedestrian fatalities, joined them to their closest block group, and looked at some different characteristics of where these crashes are happening. And we looked through a bunch of different spatial statistics, and everything that we're looking at was pointing towards less dense areas, which kind of surprised me. I figured pedestrian bicycle safety is an urban thing, density, but these are actually happening in less dense areas. So on the left, you can see population density. The locations where pedestrians are being killed are growing less and less and less dense. Still fairly dense. They're still urban, but they're less dense urban. We have transit access on the right. I don't show it here, but we also looked at road density, intersection density, a number of different metrics that were all pointing towards less dense over this decade. The one that was most surprising to me was pedestrian commute mode share. So 20 years ago, as you would expect, pedestrians were being killed in areas with higher than average pedestrian activity to work. And over the 20 years, that has decreased to the point where in the last year, the study, pedestrians were actually being killed in areas with less than average walking to work. Which the national average is pretty low. So the fact that pedestrians are being killed in areas with even less pedestrian commute activity than that, that was really pointing to something we didn't expect. So we're kind of scratching our heads after looking at all these statistics and thinking, like, where are these areas? What does this look like? So we decided to actually map it and look at it on a map. And what we did is we looked at 9 cities. We looked at the 3 largest cities in the US, excluding New York City, 3 fastest growing cities, and 3 fastest shrinking cities. And the results were pretty consistent and, to us, pretty surprising. So we looked at the first 4 years of our study, 1999 to 2002. That's going to be on the top here. And 2017 to 2020, the last 4 years of our study. And the scales are the same. The heat map scales are the same for all of these maps that I'm going to show you. So you can see this is LA. 20 years ago, pedestrian fatalities were happening in downtown, as you would expect. Over the 20 years, it migrated out into the suburbs, specifically South Central LA. Chicago, again, 20 years ago, downtown was a big hotspot. Now downtown's not even really a hotspot anymore. It's West Chicago, South Chicago. Houston had downtown as a hotspot and a couple other smaller ones, and now you can see that's migrated out. Phoenix has migrated out. San Antonio, so again, downtown migrating out. Dallas, and the fastest shrinking city in the US, Detroit. You can see that 20 years ago, downtown was the only hotspot, and now downtown's not a hotspot, and pretty much the entire rest of the city is a hotspot. So this kind of makes sense with that trend of 80% increase in pedestrian fatalities over the last 15 years or so. Because if pedestrian safety is a downtown issue, downtowns are relatively small, our overall numbers are going to be relatively small. But if now pedestrian safety is turning into a suburban issue, right? Suburbs are huge. So of course we would expect to see increasing numbers of pedestrian fatalities. And so to put some numbers on all that, we have all the details for all the cities, but I'll look at the bottom row there, all cities combined that we examined. You can see about a 25% increase over the study period in pedestrian fatalities. In the downtown areas, there was actually a 63% decrease in pedestrian fatalities. So almost 25% increase overall. Pedestrian safety is getting much, much, much worse, but the downtowns are getting much, much, much safer. Outside of downtown increased about a third, 32% there. And you can see some of those decreases in some of these downtown areas. LA went from 49 to 20, Chicago 14 to 3, Detroit 21 to 2, right? So our downtowns aren't really the safety focus anymore. It's very much a citywide regional issue. We also looked at the socioeconomics of these areas, and as you would expect, the pedestrian fatalities are happening in areas with higher rates of poverty, lower rates of educational attainment. So one thing we hypothesize from all of this is it could be due to, at least in part, the suburbanization of poverty. So poverty has historically been an inner city phenomenon. Over the last couple decades, as, like Bob said, kind of the inner ring suburbs, as those age, a lot of those suburbs are now 75 years old. By today's housing standards, those aren't really desirable places to live anymore. A lot of poverty has migrated out into those suburbs. Over 50% of people living below the poverty line in the US now live in the suburbs. So you take these populations that might have limited access to automobiles, and you put them in suburbs that were designed to move people by automobile, but they really maybe have no choice. They need to walk, bike, use transit on these very unsafe roads. So that might be kind of what's explaining this movement out into the suburbs and this overall increase in our pedestrian fatalities. So then we asked the question, well, okay, we've got some big picture hotspots. What do these suburbs actually look like? So again, working with Osiris and a few other folks, we're looking specifically, and this one isn't published yet. This is a CPBS report if you want to check it out. We're looking specifically at the city of Chicago, which had really good data. And here we're looking at 2009 to 2011 as our before period, 2018 to 2020 as our after. And we're finding that a large increase in the pedestrian, I think this was serious injuries and fatalities, is increasing in a kind of area between 1 to 7 miles from downtown. So downtown is experiencing fewer of these crashes, but it's very much kind of this inner ring suburban area. And so we looked at what kind of roads are experiencing the largest increases over that decade. We found, again, on the top, kind of the usual suspects of the arterials, but on the bottom, what we're finding is land use is really important, one of the most important factors that we found. And specifically, the largest increases are happening in areas called urban mix. So it's not the shopping malls, it's not the retail centers, it's not the big box stores, it's very much urban mix. So arterials going through urban mix neighborhoods. And so here we've identified the 3 corridors that had the largest pedestrian KA, serious injury and fatality increases. And here's what those corridors look like. So they're not your big 5-7 lane arterial roads. They are arterials, relatively fast, relatively wide, but a 3-lane arterial signed at 30 miles per hour. And this had an increase of 9 pedestrian serious injury and fatality crashes. Another one, again, kind of that urban mixed land use, residential, commercial, on a similar looking arterial. And this was the third corridor, the third largest increase. Okay, so some implications for all this. So I think we really need to shift the conversation for pedestrian safety beyond areas that maybe look like this, right? For those downtowns, we saw a 65% decrease in pedestrian fatalities. Only 2% of pedestrian fatalities are happening in areas that look like this. So I think it's maybe time that, and it's not to dismiss our downtowns, right? There's been great progress made in downtown. So maybe it's time that we take some lessons learned from places like this and start applying them into other areas of our cities. And so when I look at a map like this, I kind of start to wonder, well, what's happening in these other hot spots around town? And it kind of starts we have these hotspots, these nodes around the central downtown area. It kind of gets me thinking about, maybe it's because we just taught this in class last week, but a garden city model, right? Where we've got a concentrated node of development and then other nodes surrounding that. These are walkable, bikeable nodes connected by transit, connected by for driving as well. Maybe you call this a 15-minute city. I always like the term urban villages. But I would argue that our downtowns have a lot of pedestrian activity, but clearly we have other areas of our city that have the land use to have that pedestrian activity, but we just don't have the infrastructure there yet. So maybe it's time to start taking some of those lessons learned and applying it to some of these other areas of our city. I think it's time that we did that. So the northwestern hotspot here in Dallas, this is what that northwestern hotspot looks like. So this is a major medical facility. This is actually a train line that has a stop right here for the medical facility. Clearly, the city wants people to use transit to get to this facility, get off the transit and walk to the medical facilities. But then you look at the infrastructure here and pretty clear why this is a pedestrian safety hotspot, right? So we've got that land use, we've got the pedestrian activity, we've got a lot of things lined up. The infrastructure is just lagging behind. So maybe it's time we kind of start applying some of those lessons learned to areas that might look like this currently. I always dislike relying on crashes and waiting for pedestrians to die to try to prioritize where we focus. So one other thing that pops into my head is that if we don't want to take this reactive approach, I'll plug the pedestrian level of traffic stress that the team at University of Wisconsin has been developing. This can be a good way for us to kind of identify and prioritize areas that are ripe for making it safer, better for walking without having to rely on a pedestrian fatality to occur. And so I'll wrap it up with something I'm calling the multimodal safety paradigm. And I want to tie this back to some of those statistics that I mentioned at the beginning. And so this is kind of a new way of thinking. I'm going to throw it out and love to hear what people think about it. I think it's important to do some of the things we were just talking about, not only because it's important to save the lives of pedestrians, of course, but it's vital to do these things if we want to reach our overall transportation safety goals. So I want to give a shout out to David Ederer, and I think I saw Rachel Panic on the call, and the rest of the team that put this paper together. This team introduced the hierarchy of controls to transportation, the transportation world. And this comes from OSHA, so it's thinking about workplace hazards. But basically, if you want to minimize a damage from a hazard, the most effective way is to eliminate the hazard. If you can't eliminate the hazard, then you try to control the hazard, make it less damaging. And then if you're still going to have a conflict with that hazard, then you can go to the bottom and try to mitigate that damage. They call it PPE, really trying to lower the severity for when you do have a conflict with that hazard. So thinking about transportation safety, what would be the hazard for transportation safety? Sure, a pedestrian can trip over an uneven sidewalk and skin their knee, but really the real hazard here is being struck by a motor vehicle. Things like speed management can try to control that hazard, but it doesn't eliminate it, right? If we're talking about eliminating the hazard, we need to talk about reducing and shortening car trips. That's going to limit our exposure to the hazard in our transportation safety systems, transportation systems. I'm not going radical and proposing we ban or prohibit cars or anything like that. All right, so how can we reduce or shorten car trips? Well, we can promote multimodality, right? Making good places where people can walk, bike, use public transportation. That's going to be the real way to eliminate that hazard. Then, of course, we're never going to get down to zero car trips. There will still be car trips, so there will still be hazards out there. So then can we control that hazard? That's when we really get into the safe systems approach, speed management, separating users in space and time. We're trying to control that hazard, but not necessarily eliminate it. And then crash worthiness would be at the bottom, where if a crash still does occur, we want to mitigate that damage through seat belts, airbags, emergency response, things like that. So I'm calling this the multimodal transportation safety paradigm. And I would argue safe systems is solidly on the control level, but it's not really getting into that elimination level. Safer vehicles, safer speeds, that's control. Safer roads, that's control. Safer people maybe starts to get at that. But I think we really need to have a good conversation in the transportation world about the importance of walking and biking, building good places where people have other options for how they get around. This is still currently under peer review, but I want to get it out there. So we're finding evidence of this on a lot of different levels. So the international level, we drive more and we have more people killed by cars. Even on the US state level, states that have more driving have more people killed by cars. So hopefully this reframes the importance of building walkable, bikeable, transit-friendly places. Really reinforces that importance. And I'll finish off with this. I saw this in the ITE journal a couple weeks ago. I think this is a great example of kind of the safe systems approach. So we've built a system where clearly 100%, we're assuming 100% of people are going to drive, and then we try to control that and try to make that safe. All right, is this walkable, bikeable? No, not really. I don't think so. So maybe a place that is taking the multimodal approach looks something like this, where we built a place where people have other options how they get around. It depends not just on the infrastructure, but the land use. It can also be economic levers as well. Anything that is lowering that exposure, giving people other options to get around, that's going to eliminate the hazard. Then we can talk about controlling and mitigating the hazard. But it's most important to be building these walkable, bikeable places if we want to reach our overall transportation safety goals. All right, and I think we've got 15 minutes for Q&A, so thanks everybody for sticking around.
All right, let's get to a few questions here. This is for Bob. Do you have any theories on why Milwaukee's downtown didn't see the same decrease as other cities?
some theories, but I think it's a little bit unclear. I think part of it is the way the city of Milwaukee's boundary is drawn, because there have been some increases further away from downtown that have been notable over the last decade plus. But it depends on where the city boundary goes. The other piece is that the city of Milwaukee does have a little bit more downtown population than a lot of other cities of a similar size. And so it may still have relatively higher exposure because of people living down there. It just wasn't a loss of the jobs during the pandemic, for example. So that's my best guess at this point.
All right, we've got a few questions that kind of hit on the same thing. What role do you guys think number of lanes, width of lanes, speed limits, larger vehicles? I think we've all kind of noticed in a lot of cities there's a lack of enforcement now, where people feel like they can speed and nobody's going to catch them. What kind of role do you think all that plays in this issue?
So I saw those questions coming in. I was like, oh yeah, those are great questions, because I think all of us on in this area of research are asking those questions. Here's how I think about it right now in the data that we've seen. So yes and yes, it's big roadways, it's high-speed roadways, and it's behavior. I think that because in the US we have so many roadways that have been designed with high capacity for vehicles, really peak hour based. There's many hours of the day that you can speed without traffic congestion slowing you down. And as enforcement has tailed off over the last decade, and there's some good data. New York Times had a story that came out in 2024 showing the number of traffic tickets that went down during the late 2010s. That people may actually be driving faster now on those roadways and taking advantage of that system. So that itself could be leading to part of this problem. That's part of what I'm seeing now.
Yeah, I would say I don't know, to me, I call it the perfect storm of, we have the roadways, we have the big vehicles, we have the distraction, lack of enforcement, or, people's behaviors changing, more antisocial behavior, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, it's kind of all of those things coalescing to see these safety outcomes. But I don't know, one thing I always bring up in my classes, because they're civil engineering classes and we're talking about roads, to me, it still all comes down to a lot of it comes down to the roads. So for instance, distraction. Yeah, sure, distraction isn't helping the situation, but there's smartphones in European countries and their trends have been going down strongly. Why? Because, even if you're distracted and you're driving 15 miles an hour, well, it's not going to end up in a fatality or a serious injury. You can have a big F-150 on a European street and you're driving 15 miles an hour and it's not going to end up in a serious injury fatality. So I think for our American context, it's a perfect storm of a lot of different issues. No one smoking gun, but really a lot of it, to me, comes down to the streets. And then also, like I was talking about, the land use as well. I think we need to have that conversation as well.
All right. Next question. Do you see this these injuries and fatalities affecting any age groups more than others? Like, is it affecting elderly people more, children more, anything like
Yeah,
that?
that was a great question. I saw that one in the chat too. So we've seen a big decrease in pedestrian fatalities among children. So younger than age 18, that's been a big drop off over time. It's actually probably one of the big reasons why we've seen why we saw the decrease over 30 years from the 70s through the 2000 aughts. There were just fewer kids being killed. And, obviously that's a good thing. We don't want to see that. But the reason when we look at the data is often because there's just fewer kids out walking. So that's not a good thing for our society if we want more active type transportation. Also, on the older adult side, we don't see data that there's a big increase in people over 65 getting hit. It's really that age 18 through 64, that what we call these working age populations, that have seen big increases in pedestrian fatalities.
Okay, so next question is, a lot of times we see this compared to international statistics, but they have different cultural norms, they have different sized vehicles, their cities are designed completely differently historically. So what's the best way to look at international statistics, and what can we really learn from them that can be applied in the United States?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think we can still, yeah, it's not going to happen overnight, but I mean, we can learn from street designs from international perspectives, and yeah, maybe not every single street in a city like Albuquerque, New Mexico, not every single street's going to look like a street in Sweden tomorrow. But I mean, I think there's still a lot that we can learn from their streets and maybe concentrating that in specific areas of the city to start. That we know the land use backs it. We know there's pedestrian activity. So I think there is still a lot that we can learn in terms of street design. And then also, I think there's a lot that we can learn in terms of land use, appropriate land use planning, accessible land use planning. I know that hasn't really been part of the conversation, but I really do think it's starting to become part of the conversation. We actually just had Roger Millar, former Washington State DOT secretary, speak at our New Mexico Traffic Safety Summit this morning, and they put in land use into their safe systems approach. So I do think it's becoming part of the conversation, and it really needs to be. And we can learn a lot from international peers.
I think that saying an international comparison is a problem, or we can't make those, is to some extent a way of saying, oh, well, there's nothing we can do. But I think the international comparisons, even if they're a big change from our system, show that there are ways to produce systems that have fewer pedestrian fatalities and fewer serious injuries. They exist out there. Certainly, we'd have a long way to go to change our system to become something more like that. But as Nick is saying, we can learn about street design, we can learn about land use practices. On the land use front, I think there's an important conversation that needs to start, and it's going to take a long time, but I think state departments of transportation and transportation at the local level, as far as how we've built our roadway systems, has essentially followed land use. It's followed where uh, development is projected and saying, hey, we need to provide roads to that. And it's responsive to that. Departments of transportation haven't really been at the forefront of the conversation to say, hey, you know what? If you built the new developments out there in a sprawling fashion, then we'd have to build all these big wide roads to get to them. How about we not do that? How about we reinvest in the roadways that we originally built and actually make those more multimodal? And so that level of conversation, I think, needs to happen. But that means the organizations themselves, people who work for the TOTs, people who work for local governments who are in charge of local land use decisions, need to be talking much more strategically than they have in the past.
All right, next question. What were the limitations based on the data that were available, and what variables do you wish you had access to, or what data points do you wish the government would start collecting?
I mean, yeah, definitely a limitation, especially with the work looking at serious injuries and fatalities, and some of the work looking at minor injuries as well. Just the crash data is just lacking. And no offense to responding police officers, but they're not trained to diagnose injury severity. We actually did a paper on this, and the peer reviewer said you can't call it diagnosing an injury severity. They're not diagnosing, they're just estimating. Right. So I think we found like 50% of minor injuries are actually severe, and 50% of severe injuries are actually only minor. So that's definitely a limitation. And then all the unreported pedestrian crashes. Yeah, if we could get better data on all of that, maybe some linkage between hospital data and crash data. I know that's been talked about for generations, but something like that would be great.
I've got three, and I think all of them have been brought up in the chat at some point. Really good thoughts on those. One, from the behavior side, really good data on speed, vehicle speed in corridors over time, different times of day. We really need to know more how speed is changing. And we're getting some better data from smartphone, et cetera, type sources, but really having that longitudinally. Second, pedestrian exposure. Where are people walking? And what types of people are walking, people with disabilities, people of other backgrounds, needing to really understand these different groups and their exposures in different locations throughout regions, not just in downtown areas, et cetera. And then lastly, data on pedestrian crashes and lighting. What's the effect of lighting at night? And somebody mentioned LED headlights. These are some issues that came up, and we've got some insights in as a part of the NCHRP 1797 study that's just about to come out, led by Tool Design with Safe Streets Research and Rebecca Sanders. We'll see that out soon, and so there should be some insights there.
And I also just want to plug, I see Sarisha Couturi from Portland State's on the call. Her and I are working together to organize a session, TRB annual meeting, looking at how to use some of these new technologies that are out there today to get better idea of pedestrian exposure. So maybe keep an eye out for that if you're going to be at TRB in January.
All right, we'll do one more. Do you have any theories or insights about why so many crashes have shifted to nighttime?
Here's an initial one. I think that it may have a lot to do with how exposure has changed. Nick mentioned the suburbanization of poverty. I think that there may have been some shift in how jobs have moved around regions. And we were trying to tease that out some with our study at the census tract level, and we had, the retail jobs, and we found that to be significant. But I think there's probably more going on. Somebody mentioned in the chat location of warehousing. Maybe there's other service jobs that lead to more pedestrian activity or more driving activity along higher risk corridors in the suburbs at night. But that needs more work too. I don't know, Nick, if you have thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's, the spatial shifts that we talked about, more pedestrian activity. I think exposure does have something to do with it. More people walking at night and more people walking at night in areas out in the suburbs that really don't accommodate that very well. Arterial roads out in the suburbs where maybe it's a quarter mile or even in Albuquerque, half a mile between safe crossing locations. So yeah, I think exposure does have something to do with it, the location of that exposure. But yeah, even then, we're seeing increases in severity during the day as well. So something's happening during the day that's really pushing everything towards the more severe end of the spectrum. So I think that all has something to do with it. But like I said before, kind of this perfect storm. Yeah.
If you have higher speeds, they're going to more likely lead to higher injuries if they're at night too, because there's less reaction time to be able to see somebody. So that may be underlying a lot of these trends.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and I'll give you guys a chance to, if you have any closing words. Yeah.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah,
Great
right.
to see all the questions in the chat too.
Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. And yeah, feel free to check out our Center for Pedestrian and Bicyclist Safety website, check out our webinars, newsletter, all that. And yeah, thanks everybody.
Yep, thanks. We'll see you next time.